And it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Andreas Johansson, who will soon address you on this topic, Pragmatic Muslim Politics, the case of Sri Lanka Muslim Congress. Please, come in. Welcome. We're just getting started, so please find a seat. Now, the title is also the title of a soon-to-be published Springer book. The book is a unique case study built on a close reading of political speeches and documents produced by Sri Lankan Muslim Congress, and also interviews with key actors in the party gathered during Andreas Johansson's fieldwork. Dr. Johansson is a PhD in history of religion from Lund University in Sweden. And apart from his work in Sri Lanka, he also has a great interest in Japan. And while he is in town, tomorrow actually he will inaugurate an exhibition of photographs, and he's a skilled photographer, of Yakuza tattoos, and also launch the paperback version of his book called Yakuza Tattoo. So if you have time tomorrow, there are still a number, not that many tickets left on, and now you have to help me out. Is it Eventbrite? Eventbrite? How's the stress? Anyone who knows?
Event.
I trust you.
Yeah.
So, what?
Second to the stress on the event.
Eventbrite.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go for that the rest of my life. At a place called the 70s. So you just Google Andreas' name and tattoo, and you'll find it. And it's on between 7 and 11, I think. Yeah, possibly 6. We couldn't agree on that. Yeah.
No.
And further, Dr. Johansson is director of the Swedish South Asian Studies Network at Lund University, and as such a possible future collaboration partner of the AKU ISMC. So without further ado, please, let's give Andreas a hand.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas, and thank you for inviting me here. I've been here all day talking to the director of the center here for future collaborations, perhaps. So I'm pretty excited about the research that is going on here, actually. So pretty impressed. So today I'm going to talk about my upcoming book. It's going to be released in May, and it's basically my PhD thesis. So the book investigates the use of religious terms and symbols in politics. More specifically, it analyzes Muslim politics in Sri Lanka. The point of the book is to give a broader picture of Islam and politics in general. When scholars of Islamic studies and religious studies write about Muslim political parties, they tend to write about Islamist parties or post-Islamist parties or violent organization. I think this is a general statement I'm dare to claim, so to speak. But of course, the world of Muslim politics is much wider. And I think sometimes when political scientists write about non-fundamentalistic political parties, religious futures are often brushed aside. Even though these religious futures are presented as crucial by the party themselves. So the aim of my book is therefore to analyze the role of religious terms and symbols within a non-fundamentalistic party, namely the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress, that has been a part of the democratization process in Sri Lanka since the 1980s. Thereby, I hope to broaden the research on political parties founded on religious ideologies. So Jonas already told you a little bit about the documents that I'm analyzing, but it's official party documents, it's parliament speeches. I have done interviews with members of the highest decision-making body of the SLMC as well. But let's start sort of with some context and on Sri Lanka in general. Maybe you're sort of familiar with this, but I think it's still a good idea to get this context. So this is in no way a perfect map of the Muslims in Sri Lanka. It's a way to show the diversity of Muslims in Sri Lanka. So there are many definitions, but most of the Muslims in Sri Lanka are Sunni. Within the Sunni definition, you will sometimes hear definitions like Sufi or reformists. Of course, most of the Muslims in Sri Lanka, at least to my knowledge, do not say that they are either reformist or Sufi, right? But these categories are quite interesting, I think. But let's start with the so-called Sufi. So in the Sri Lankan context, a Sufi almost always equals a person that is part of a mosque that will have a buried saint, or there will be practices among these groups that we traditionally would describe as Sufi, such as a sheikh or the concept of baraka. These mosques sometimes also are visited by other Muslim communities, or other religious communities, I would say. So just to give one example of a Sufi sheikh that I have met in Sri Lanka, and this is a quite odd example, but still an interesting one. So this man is a Sufi sheikh in the eastern part of the country, and he sort of can cure people using his cell phone. So you can sort of call this man, and for example, if you have a knee injury, right, you can put your cell phone on your knee, and he says something, and your knee will be cured. And in the Sri Lankan context, that he will be considered a Sufi, even though it's an odd example. So the term reformist is quite confusing to me, but maybe some of you guys can explain that to me. But in the Sri Lankan context, at least, as I understand it, this almost always equal like a Salafi or a conservative person. Definitely an anti-Sufi one. This is my take. I don't recognize this term in the Middle East and so on, but in the South Asian context, I think it's quite usual. So the interesting thing about these groups is that there have been violent outbreaks between these groups in Sri Lanka. And the so-called reformist groups has attacked Sufi groups and Sufi mosques. So there's definitely a tension going on at the moment in Sri Lanka, and it's a quite new phenomenon, as I understand it. So there are also small Shia groups in Sri Lanka. Apparently, there are a small village in the east coast that are completely Shia. I have not been there myself, but apparently there are one village at least. And there are also groups like Mosques and Mosques, right? But to my knowledge, these groups have not been targeted in any way. So looking at the other set of categories that I have listed here, we can talk about language and nation. Most of the Muslims in Sri Lanka speak Tamil. Some of them speak Malay as the first language, and some of them speak Sinhalese. There's also a question of nationhood. Of course, Muslims in Sri Lanka are Sri Lankan in the passport, right? But you will find sometimes that they are accused of being a part of the Muslim nation instead of Sri Lanka. So the Ummah, right? The Muslim nation. And one thing that is sort of interesting to look at is sports. In the Sri Lankan case, of course, there are cricket, right? So I will just show you an example of this nation struggle between Muslims. You don't have to read this at all. But I was in Sri Lanka in 2011, and the World Cup of cricket was held. And one of the group stage matches, Sri Lanka were playing Pakistan in Colombo. And before that match, Muslim clergies went out in the newspaper claiming that, hey, Sri Lanka Muslims, we are playing Pakistan tomorrow, but don't forget to cheer for Sri Lanka, which is your nation, right? So I asked my friend who is a Muslim, and why did they go out in the news talking about this? And he said, well, sometimes we Muslims do actually cheer for Pakistan in cricket because it's a Muslim nation. Right. So this is a fatwa that I found online as sort of answering this dilemma. And the fatwa itself doesn't really support Sri Lanka or sports for that matter at all, actually. But it's an interesting way to look at it. The party that I'm going to speak on here today has to deal with all of these sort of dimensions: language, nation, and so on. Before talking about them, I just want to show you some pictures of some mosques, just to show the religious diversity in the landscape. So this is a mosque in Colombo, which is probably the most famous one. It's the Red Mosque, or Jami al-Far Mosque. It's a Sunni mosque. This is a small mosque in Colombo as well. It's a Malay mosque, the military Malay mosque, I think it's called. And here we have a Memon mosque, also in Colombo. So this is a Sufi mosque, which I have forgotten the name of, but it's on the east coast, and this is one of the mosques that was attacked by the so-called reformist groups. And this tower you see here was actually torn down, and people were killed. Right, here is a map that I have borrowed from Dennis McGilvray, who is a famous anthropologist working on Sri Lanka Muslims. It shows some of the important sites of Muslims in Sri Lanka, and most of the Muslims live on the east coast. Over here, it's 1/3 of the Muslim community. But you will also find larger Muslim communities in Colombo, in Galle, in the west coast. You will find Muslim living in Kalkatia, Putalam, that was evicted in 1990 by the LTTE. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course in the south coast as well, you will also find villages in the south coast that are completely Malay, as I understand it. So just a brief introduction to the history of Muslims in Sri Lanka. Overviews of the community in Sri Lanka generally categorize its inhabitants in Sinhalese, Tamil, or Muslim. Although this categorization is a simplification, it is a useful beginning. So the majority of the population in Sri Lanka consider themselves to be Sinhalese, who are predominantly Buddhists. The second largest minority is Tamil, which is predominantly Hindu, 15%, and then we have Muslims, 9.7%. So the origin of the Muslim community in Sri Lanka may be traced back to the trade that occurred in South Asia and Southeast Asia between the Middle East and this region. Traders from the Middle East, that is Arabs and Persians, first had commercial interest in the south of India, but that also sort of spread to Sri Lanka. The merchants from the Middle East settled down and married Tamil women and Sinhalese women in the east coast of the country. One of the colonial powers that Sri Lanka had over the years, the Portuguese, used the term Moor to describe the Muslims of the island, as they did for Muslims, of course, all over the world. As a consequence, a local Moorish identity was established. So the stories about these Arab merchants settling down in Sri Lanka became sort of the official story when you talked about them being distinct from Tamils. The Moorish label developed into a self-definition for Muslims in Sri Lanka in the early 20th century, beginning with the elite, who promoted it as a unique racial identity, which they labeled as Ceylon Moors. The Ceylon Moors identity referred to those who had a presumed Arab origin, which is distinguished them mainly from the local Tamils. The Muslim political leaders continued to promote this Moorish identity with the focus on the collective Arab connection, pointing out that Muslims are not bound to any specific language, even though most of them spoke Tamil. And this is a very important factor if you look at the south part of India, which sees themselves as Tamil with an inherent to the Islamic faith. But the story here in Sri Lanka is that this is an own connection, right? The Dutch, another colonial power that came into power in Sri Lanka, brought another large group of Muslims, and that was the Malays, who came as militaries. Of course, there are historical bounds between Sri Lanka and the Malay communities long before this as well. But this was the first time a large group of Malays came to the island and settled down. The identification as an own ethnicity continued throughout the colonial years. Another incident that symbolized this strength in the Muslim identity is actually symbolized here in one of the pictures. It's the fez. And there's an incident called the fez cap incident that took place in 1905. It occurred when a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court objected to the wearing of fezzes in court, and which has resulted in a massive demonstration that spread around the island. One of the explanations why the Muslim elite started to wear fezzes is attributed to Arabi Pasha, an Egyptian in exile and a person who inspired Muslim activists throughout the country at this time. So I will sort of come back to how the Muslim identity changes from Moor to Muslim when I talk about the SLMC in the beginning here. But first, just briefly mention the conflict, which is, of course, very crucial to understand what's going on in Sri Lanka. So I will keep this very short, but ethnic tensions between Tamil groups and Sinhalese were on the rise since British left in the 1948. The Tamil-speaking groups felt discriminated, you could say, because the language of Tamil became a secondary language in the country, and that was noticeable in the schools, for example. So, in 1983, a civil war broke out. And it broke out with the Tamil anti-riot, which is referred to as the Black July. It spread around the country, and a lot of Tamil civilians got killed. The riot was a response to Tamil attacks on Sri Lankan army. So the civil war lasted between 1983 and 2009, and it was between the Sri Lankan government and different Tamil separate groups. And of course, the one most famous group is the Liberation Tigers of the Tamil Ilam, LTTE. So some of the Muslims in the beginning, in the 70s, started to engage also in this Tamil activism, because of course the major of them spoke Tamil. However, this changed pretty fast. Muslim also became a target for the LTTEs, or the Tamil separatism. And this is sort of demonstrated in two events in the 1990s. And the one event I showed you before, which was the eviction of the Muslim community from the north. And another event you will see in the picture here is a massacre that occurred in the town of Kadankudi in 1990. That killed all over, I think, 150 people. So these bullet holes are still in these mosques, actually, if you visit them today. Right. So I looked at various sources in regards to SLMC, and I think the early sources of the SLMC is very interesting. For example, the Constitution. I think these sources reflect really what's happening at the moment, at the time, and this is in the beginning of the 1980s. It's in the midst of the Tamil Tigers rebellion, but it's also at the same time as Dawa movements came to the island, missionary groups. So with these missionary groups came the change in calling Muslims from Moors to Muslims. This changed over this. And this was something that SLMC definitely used. The first leader of SLMC, which you see here, is Ashraf. He was a part of the Dawah movement at the time. And as my sources tell me, this was the Jamaat Islamist Dawah movement. He was educated in law, and he came from a family with political background. So the organizational structure of the SLMC shows some interesting similarity to the Pakistani Islamist organization Jamaat-e-Islami. The founder of Jamaat-e-Islami was Maududi, and his thoughts and ideas were well spread during this period in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Considering the fact that Maududi was from the Indian subcontinent, it is not unlikely that the Jamaat-e-Islami idea was spread to Sri Lanka as well. And we know that Ashraf was a part of the Dawah movement, even it was a short while perhaps, but he was a part of that. So therefore it's highly possible that the SLMC's early documents were influenced by the Jamaat-e-Islami. The SLMC was perhaps not trying to copy the Jamaat-e-Islami, but instead it was copying the discursive elements from the Dawah movement. So the first indication of a discursive element between these two organizations is the very idea that Islam can constitute the foundation of a political party within a democratic system. The second indication is the elite character of the SLMC, which is very similar to what Jamaat-e-Islami has. There is a leader on the top and who has most of the power. The third indication is that SLMC and the Jamaat-e-Islami both put emphasis on an active membership entailing submission to a set of pre-specified rules. The fourth indication is the affiliated bodies, such as the Student and Women Organization, which is similar to the Jamaat-e-Islami. The last indication is the Shura, which is in both cases work as a consulting assembly in the party. So while these similarities does exist, there are also important differences, of course. For example, the very first chapter of SLMC's constitution states that the Holy Quran and the tradition of the Holy Prophet shall be the supreme guidelines of the party. So with the words supreme guidelines, the leading members of the SLMC open up for possibilities of choosing whether or not to refer to these religious sources in the politics. Even though the guidelines are said to be supreme, they are still merely guidelines. Another difference, which is extremely important, is the fact that there is no aspiration within the SLMC, at least not the explicitly, for a political domination of Sri Lanka as a whole. There is no notion of a theocratic Islamic state, and I think this here somewhere that the early research get this sort of wrong. They confuse discursive elements from the Jamaat-e-Islami to say that SLMC is an Islamist party, which is obviously it's not. SLMC upholds the value and the integrity of the post-colonial state of Sri Lanka. It promotes it. Even though the SLMC do not have a traditional Islamistic agenda, the use of Islamic symbols are very important in the party. Sri Lanka Muslim Congress went into parliament in 1989. They won 4 seats, and that was the first time a Muslim political party in Sri Lanka actually made it up to the parliament. And I think this part of my book is the most interesting one. Here you can really see the use of religious symbols and languages. It builds from examples from the first leader, Ashraf, that you saw in the picture, And it also helped me to build my case against earlier researchers that has claimed that religion is exaggerated in the politics of the SLMC. So the first thing Ashraf does in Parliament is to claim that Islam is a political ideology. So as was the case in the context of the SLMC's official documents, it is in this analysis intriguing to draw some parallels between Ashraf's speeches in Parliament and ideas of Maududi. First, there is a notion of the middle path. Like Maududi, Ashraf introduced Islam as a political ideology, and it was presented as an alternative to the two dominant ideologies, namely communism and capitalism. The idea of Islam as a middle path originates from the Quranic notion of wasatiyah. This notion has been used by other political movements as well, of course. One thing that is first suggested also in the parliament by Ashraf is a promotion of the Islamic economic system, which with interest-free banks. On several occasions, Ashraf quotes the Quran, making his argument for this system. There are also numbers of issues regarding public morals that Ashraf addressed in Parliament when he speaks about Islam being the solution of society's problem. One example is when he talks about AIDS and HIV, where he wants to ban homosexuals for entering the country. He also wants to ban the use of alcohol. The speeches are interesting in many ways, but one thing that I really reflected on and tried to sort of think about was that when he presented these ideas with Islamic solutions to the problem, he almost always did that with the comparison to Buddha. So I'll give you some examples, and I'll quote. A good moral society cannot be established in Sri Lanka, a Buddhist nation where Lord Buddha himself has prohibited the taking of usury by exploitation. Economic morals are important. Or, I am a great admirer of Lord Buddha. Lord Buddha has taught the good way of life to humanity. Lord Buddha had stated that human society can be clean, it can be free of corruption, it can be free from corruption, it can keep away from evil, and one of the greatest evil identified by Lord Buddha is liquor. Islam promises a way out, which is the middle path, a path which is advocated by the most respected Buddha himself. Buddha himself has advocated the middle path. Yeah. So this goes on and on. So perhaps one should even argue that sort of Muslim politics becomes too narrow a focus when approaching the content of Ashraf's speeches. It should be named almost religious politics, I think. Especially notably is when Ashraf speaks about government institutions and how they should respond to events in the war. Here you can see no signs of Islamic terminology at all. Instead, again, we run into Buddhist concepts. It seems that in an exposed situation where Muslims are being killed outright, there is a need, and there is a need for help. The Islamic terms and symbols become less important and even unhelpful. And just to give another example how Buddha plays the role of Ashraf's speeches. But we who follow the teaching of Buddha, the teaching which this country has accepted and adopted, we who accepted the teaching of Buddha at the political level, we who follow his teaching as a commitment, and we who follow the teaching of Buddha, who said that he cannot even kill a living organism as small as an insect. Yes, yet it is we who create conditions to kill human beings. In an event in 1990, what I talked about earlier, in the Katakuri massacre in the mosques, Ashraf names jihad for the first time. And this is very interesting as well, I think. So you're all aware that jihad could be sort of stressed in different situations, and And you will expect Ashraf to talk about it in the terms of defense war, but he doesn't. He talks about it in the terms of patience. And of course, he also talks about Buddha's patience. So earlier researchers miss the fact that SLMC, since its early years, has been conducting thoroughly Muslim politics and not Islamist politics. So just to be clear, there are researchers before this book that are claiming that SLMC, when it first came into politics, was an Islamist party. And there are researchers that claim that religion has no role within the party. I claim that it's more to Muslim politics than Islamist versus secularism, which I think definitely these examples from Ashraf shows. Moving on, so Ashraf passed away in 2000 in a helicopter crash, and Rauf Hakim became the new leader of the party. In approaching the current leader, Rauf Hakim's parliament speeches from the viewpoint of Islamic languages in the parliament, the most interesting feature of that is its accent. Now it's totally gone. There are practically no examples of the use of Islamic terms and symbols. So I actually asked Rauf Hakim why don't he speak about the Quran or the Sunnah as a problem solution for Sri Lanka. So I'll quote him here. Okay, I don't quote the Quran and the Sunnah. I'm careful in a multi-ethnic society. We had a discussion on reinventing the idea so we don't impose the Muslim element or the Muslim factor, and to rebrand in such a way that it would be more acceptable and also attract the non-Muslims to the political movement, and we will try to be a little more diverse in our composition. So I think the main reason here is given is one of pragmatic considerations. Explicit reference to Islam may alienate the audience in the parliament, as well limit the scope of potential voters. It appears that as if the specific Muslim identity of the party is more a burden than a resource for the current leadership. So instead of the Quran and the Sunnah, you will find Greek philosophers in his speeches. You will find the US Constitution in his speeches, right? In another speech, Hakim officially denies the existence of any militant jihadism in Sri Lanka. And this could also be understood in this light. As I showed you earlier, there do exist, violence between Muslims in Sri Lanka. But Hakim denies it. And the strong denial of this existence of such activism from his side is understandable, because the government of Sri Lanka has been quite harsh against the military movement of the LTTE, as you probably know, in the end of the war and so on, right? Right. So what does the internal discussion about religion say in the SLMC? So I focused in my research on the High Command, which is the decision-making body of the party, and it has 89 members. And I interviewed over 30 of them, so I think I have a pretty good idea about the role of religion. So the practice of the High Command is based on the Islamic practice of shura. In this case, it means consultation. So there is a consultation among the members, and then the leader will take a decision based on this consultation, right? And whatever the decision is, the High Command will stand by it in a consensus. So 2 of the members of the High Command is religious scholars. So I asked them a little bit about their role in the High Command and how they guided the High Command to the right and wrong answer. And I got the following answer. When we make a decision, we look if it's compatible with Islam. This is what I am going to do. Is it right or is it wrong? They wanted to organize a strike to do some picketing and they made a figure of the president and finally burned the figure of the president. So the leader, will come to ask if this is acceptable to do something like that according to Islam. And we can't accept that because Islam doesn't allow it. So we have stopped a lot of demonstrations like that after Jummah prayers. Asking other members of the High Command about the religious scholars, it seems that they are seen as the moral police in the High Command. So, I quote, "In the High Command we have a few members that are connected religiously. When the party takes the wrong track, there are a few members that tells us what you are doing wrong, and if you are doing the wrong way, you must correct it. So they are the policemen inside the party and tell us what is right and what is wrong." So I think this is a sort of a paradox, or this is very interesting at least, that the Islamic practice of shura can limit the influence of Islam in the sense of religious scholars at least. So the ulama might advise, but will not have a final say on what constitutes right or wrong, because that's up to the leader, right? So, just to give a short conclusion. So, how can we then explain the use of Islamic terms in the SLMC without putting this party in an Islamist or a secular concept? I use the concept of Muslim politics that was coined by Ekelman and Piscatori. It refers to the social use of discursive elements of an Islamic religious tradition, elements that do not carry any inherent or stable meaning, but receive such meaning in the social context where they are employed, and where their emotive charge may be utilized rhetorically. The discursive practice is often intimately connected to the building of a community, and this is exactly what the SLMC is doing. Pragmatic politics can be seen as a direct opposite of politics that is ideology-driven and utopian. It also fits very well in the observation we can do by the SLMC. The main use in the party of reference of Islam and religious tradition has been to delimitate Muslims as an own separate voice. This is done by using very vague concepts and referring to the Quran and Sunnah and as the supreme guidelines, for example, but not really in a specific way. While there were some initial attempts, particularly during the Ashraf time, to put forward specific Islamic solutions to social problems with direct reference to the scriptures, particularly in the economic field, if any such attempts can be seen today. This book is organized around key arguments that SLMC uses religious terms and symbols has been pragmatic and changed depending on the context and shifting political landscape. The use of religious symbols and terms in the SLMC differs in internal party documents and public visibility. In the internal party documents, Islamic symbols and terms are used to delimit Muslims as a specific group. In the political context of post-colonial Sri Lanka. In public documents, on the other hand, we see a significant historical change. These documents reveal the use of Islamic terms and symbols as part of solution to the social problems in society. But such a use changed following the 9/11 anti-Muslim global emerged. It emerged across the globe. So the SLMC's response to this is sort of to delimit any Islamic terms and symbols in Parliament. It is understandable from a strategic point of view that the SLMC would change its rhetoric so as not be framed as an Islamist in a country where Muslims as a minority can be sort of exposed to Islamophobia. However, this strategy has not fully been successful it has not been successful as rebranding itself as a multi-ethnic party in the eyes of their political opponents or the public discourse. I also want to claim that equally important is the question, the research that simply dismisses the SLMC as a non-religious party. If we do not analyze religion thoroughly in parties that explicitly refer to the Holy Quran and the Holy Sunnah, what then are we left with? It appears as if scholars feel an urge to label Muslim parties such as the SLMC as either Islamist or non-religious, as if Muslim parties could not occupy a moderate position. The fact that moderate pragmatic Muslim parties such as the SLMC do not want to infuse Islam in society as a large should not, on the hand, make us ignore the very real effects, for instance, attitudes towards homosexuality or, for that matter, peace ideas. So political parties that advocate pragmatic Muslim politics are worthy a subject for investigation, as Islamist parties are. And they need to be examined equally thoroughly in their own right. Thank you.